Latinos comprise almost 20% of the US population, with a third being foreign-born immigrants mostly residing in urban areas of California, Texas, Florida, and New York. First-generation immigrants face economic disadvantages due to their low human capital, but research shows significant earning gains across immigrant generations. The first generation consists of foreign-born Latinos, while the second generation encompasses US-born Latinos with at least one foreign-born parent. Notably, second-generation Latinos already demonstrate improved earnings due to higher levels of human capital accumulation. As such, I ask, what are the differences in barriers experienced by first and second-generation Mexican immigrants in the workplace, and how are these barriers mediated through their social and cultural experiences? To answer these questions, I chose to carry out my interviews with Mexican immigrants residing in Decatur, Illinois. It is important to note before we move on that I myself am a second-generation Mexican immigrant from Decatur, and I remained aware of this and the effects it could have throughout the entirety of my study. To reduce my bias, I used my connection to the community to get referrals for potential participants to begin a snowball sample so I could not handpick participants myself, and so I could avoid the community members that I personally knew. I did 20 interviews in total, interviewing 10 first-gen Mexicans and 10 second-gen Mexicans. All but one of the first-gen participants was undocumented. On the other hand, the second-gen participants were all born and raised in the US. All 20 participants were male, and they worked all types of jobs, from welders and millwrights to insulators and painters, across various different contractors within the factories of Decatur. The majority of my participants, though, were either currently working as scaffolders or had done so at one point in time in Decatur. It is among the scaffolders and the stories that I was told about scaffolding that I got the richest information. It became very apparent throughout my interviews that an ethnic enclave of self-described Hispanics existed within scaffolding. Latinos only make up 2.7% of Decatur, yet they are overrepresented in this profession. Scaffolding was regarded as a heavy job by everyone I interviewed, so it always had openings and it was always hiring. And while it's easy to just say that immigrants tend to be placed in the more laborious jobs in the US, that idea did not satisfy me. What was actually happening here? And why was this already happening in a relatively new immigrant destination? The contractors indicator use E-Verify, which is used in the hiring process to find out if applicants are eligible to work in the US. This is a nice way of saying they are checking for undocumented immigrants. But despite this, the majority of first-gen Mexican workers in Decatur are undocumented. So again, what was actually happening here? The Hispanic enclave within the workplace also meant that there was a Hispanic social network, which both undocumented Mexican immigrants and the factories themselves relied on to get employees. Recommendations are an integral part of the hiring process for Mexican immigrants. If you already know someone within the factories, they can connect you to the supervisors to get hired. This is super common in Decatur because, as many of my participants put it, the only reason they went to Decatur was because they already had a friend or a relative already living and working there. They already had their in. They were recommended by their friends or relatives, and they were given an application that went directly to their bosses. Sometimes even supervisors would ask the workers if they knew anyone who needed a job. But what does this have to do with E-Verify? You need a social security number to apply for the jobs, with or without E-Verify. So the Mexican immigrants literally buy fake social security numbers called seguros chuecos, often traveling to other cities like Chicago to get them. Then because of the recommendation system, they fill out a paper application instead of an online one because the paper applications are not checked by E-Verify. The employers are well aware that they're hiring undocumented immigrants, but they turn a blind eye because they need the workers. The Hispanic enclave also has another side effect. The primary language spoken within the enclave is Spanish. Despite this, mostly everything in the workplace is in English. Applications, safety posters, and meetings are all in English. More troubling is the fact that supervisors and other bosses usually only speak English too, making communication between the workers in the enclave and any higher-ups very difficult. This has created a ton of problems for the first-gen Mexican workers in the factories, specifically in scaffolding, because they have no way to communicate their problems or issues, or even access promotional opportunities. The participants told me stories about how they weren't even getting raises they were contractually promised. Repeatedly, I was told their supervisor, the only English-speaking Mexican at the time, was refusing to help them as well, And with no one else that could lodge a complaint, they really couldn't do anything about it, especially since they were afraid of continuing to urge their supervisor. And this was worsened by the fact that they were undocumented. So if they were fired, or if they really wanted to go somewhere else, they couldn't. They had to rely on another job having an Hispanic network, and they also had to rely on the employer turning a blind eye to hiring them, which wasn't that common. So for many, the reality was that they were stuck. Although uncommon, some first-gen Mexicans have found their way to positions of power due to their seniority and experience. Though many of these positions are informal due to their inability to fully communicate in English. But even for those first-gen Mexicans who have achieved formal supervisor positions, they are met with a glass ceiling. The contractors provide on-the-job paid training to get different certifications, but unfortunately, as of now, the training is only available in English, leaving it inaccessible to the majority of the Mexican workers. Working within the enclave is kind of a barrier itself. The lack of Anglo-socialization is limiting the language assimilation of the first-gen Mexican workers who only speak Spanish. The first-gen participants who had the ability to leave the enclave spoke highly of their new jobs. Despite the initial difficulty that came from working in a mainly Anglophone environment, working outside the enclave provided a heterogeneous space that allowed them to interact and socialize with more English speakers, opening their possibilities to learn English and obtain promotional opportunities. Many participants said learning English was only a matter of practice, so remaining in the enclave was limiting how much they were actually learning. The second-gen Mexican immigrants have the advantage of having grown up in either Decatur or some other place in the United States. They grew up going to school, speaking English, and interacting with Americans their whole lives. They are US citizens. Second-gen Mexicans did not need to enter the enclave or use the recommendation system to get hired. Many were in trade school programs throughout high school that allowed them to enter the labor force through other avenues. They could apply anywhere. They could work anywhere. But for those who do work within the enclave, a great opportunity has presented itself as the enclave continues to grow and bilingualism proves to be a required skill for communication. Unlike their predecessors, the second-gen Mexicans are able to take advantage of the on-the-job training provided by the contractors, putting them on the fast track for promotions. Their introduction into the workplace has streamlined the solution to the communication problem, not just for the workers, but for the employers themselves. Despite the continuous hiring of the first-gen Mexican immigrants, there has been no concerted effort into formally implementing Spanish into the workplace. Instead, the burden of communication is placed entirely on the bilingual workers, which in this case are the second-gen Mexicans. While it is impressive that they are getting supervisor positions faster than any first-gen ever did, their supervisor role encompasses much more than other supervisors. They participate in every level of interaction with Hispanic workers, even things outside of scaffolding. Sometimes they're even directly involved in the recommendation system by being made to help new Hispanic immigrants fill out their applications. Despite having more agency in their job selection due to their language skills and citizenship status, there is still a sense of second-class citizenship among the second-gen Mexicans, as they grapple with the burden that has been placed on them and their timidity in asking for proper compensation, which they describe as something passed on from their first-gen family members. For the first-gen Mexicans, they grapple with their exploitation in a different way. Despite lacking agency within the workplace, the first-gen does not acknowledge their position as a vulnerable one, instead creating a sense of pride around the work they do, framing themselves as the only ones capable of doing the tasks they do every day. And this pride has been the basis for a self-described Hispanic identity that has been created within the workplace and which has extended across generations and immigrant nationalities. In this study, the promotional mobility of Mexican immigrants was dependent on where in the factories they were working, with working in the enclave providing both benefits and disadvantages to both first and second generation workers. While finding work outside the enclave was challenging, it provided opportunities for Anglo-socialization not available in the enclaves. Language and legal status also played a role in the mobility of immigrants, with speaking English and/or being undocumented facilitating the socialization in the workplace and providing more opportunities for mobility. As Mexican workers continue to spread to other jobs around the factories, I predict that more enclaves will form under different circumstances than that of scaffolding. Immigrants will have more options through an increased range of the Hispanic social network, reducing the vulnerability of undocumented workers. Additionally, I expect the Spanish language to be more formally integrated into the workplace as more bilingual Mexicans achieve positions of powers, spurred by the aging second-generation Mexican population.